right, welcome to the deep dive, where we cut through the noise and get right to the juicy bits of all the information that you're interested in. You could think of this as your kind of like cheat sheet to really understanding what really matters, and we're going to try to serve up those big aha moments without like overwhelming you with a ton of information. And this deep dive, and I say this speaking directly to you, the learner, is really tailored to give you some really actionable knowledge about a really powerful approach to innovation in a way that's hopefully both engaging and directly relevant to, your desire to really understand how things work.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, we're diving deep into the world of the lean startup, which is a really revolutionary set of principles that are laid out in detail in the book of the same name.
Okay.
We've gone through and we've pulled out kind of like the most crucial and I think compelling ideas from the book to share with you today.
So our mission here is actually pretty straightforward. We want to extract the essential concepts of the lean startup, explain why they matter so much for anyone who is trying to build something new and sustainable, whether that's a business, a government program, even a nonprofit initiative. And of course, we want to equip you, the learner, with practical insights that you can actually apply in your own work or personal projects. So yeah, let's jump right in.
Right off the bat, the book kind of kicks off with the author talking about his early experiences as an entrepreneur. And he runs into this frustrating reality, which is that so many startups were just failing, even though they were following all this traditional business advice. There's this myth, isn't there, that success in the startup world is all about just, getting lucky or having this kind of magical vision.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating things right from the beginning is the author's complete rejection of that notion, right? So he draws on his own journey, both successes and failures, and starts to notice some patterns, right? And this core insight that he comes to is that startup success, it's not a crapshoot, right? It's not just a matter of chance. It can actually be engineered through a very deliberate, systematic process that can be learned.
Right.
And more importantly, I think taught. So think about that, right? A repeatable method for navigating the inherent chaos and uncertainty of building something brand new.
Totally. And he's not just kind of theorizing here, right? He talks specifically about his time at IMVU and this real transformation they went through in terms of their approach. They moved away from this kind of rigid long-term planning to this rapid experimentation, really focusing in on understanding what customers truly did, not just, and this is key, what they said they wanted, but like observing their actual behavior. And then they went for this much more data-driven, almost like a scientific method for making those crucial decisions.
Right. And I think if we zoom out a little bit, what we're seeing here is a fundamental challenge to conventional business wisdom, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of the established playbook, right, that emphasizes extensive upfront research, detailed forecasting, wasn't delivering consistent results in the highly uncertain world of early stage ventures. So IMVU became this kind of real world testing ground for what would evolve into these lean startup principles.
So in the context of the lean startup, what exactly is a startup? It's not just, those tech companies in Silicon Valley.
Right. The definition is actually quite broad and inclusive, and the book defines a startup as a human institution designed to create a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
The critical element here is extreme uncertainty, right? So we're not just talking about incremental improvements to existing products in well-established markets, right? We're talking about venturing into like uncharted territory, right?
Yeah.
Creating something genuinely novel where the path ahead is just not clear.
Right. And the implications of that definition are pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
It really changes how we traditionally think about who qualifies as a startup.
Absolutely. The book explicitly says that this definition doesn't depend on company size, the specific industry, or even whether it's like a for-profit business. So if you're a small team working in a garage, or you're a skunkworks project within a large corporation, even a government agency, launching an innovative public service, a nonprofit, pioneering a new approach to a social issue, if you're operating under these conditions of extreme uncertainty, to build something new, you fit the definition of a startup. In fact, the first principle of the book lays out emphasizes that entrepreneurs are everywhere.
Yeah, that really resonated with me too, the idea that entrepreneurship, it's not just this title reserved for a select few founders in hoodies, right?
And I think the second principle builds directly on this by saying entrepreneurship is management. So even a very small startup is still an institution, right? It's a group of people working together towards a common goal. And it's not solely about just the initial brilliant idea, right?
Right.
It demands a specific type of management, one that's tailored to this unpredictable nature of extreme uncertainty. And the book even goes so far as to argue that entrepreneurs should actually be a recognized job title in any organization that depends on innovation for its future success.
Mm.
It's a call to really acknowledge that skillfully navigating uncertainty is a fundamental management competency in today's rapidly changing world.
So we understand the definition and this core idea that this is a process that can be learned and managed.
Yeah.
The book then kind of lays out 5 core principles, and we've touched on the first 2. What are those remaining 3 that really form this like bedrock of the methodology?
So the third principle is validated learning.
Okay.
And this really shifts the core purpose of a startup, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about producing a lot of features or even generating revenue right away, right? Right. The primary objective of a startup is to learn how to build a sustainable business.
Okay.
And this learning isn't based on, hunches or gut feelings. It needs to be scientifically validated through these frequent experiments that test the critical assumptions that are underlying the overall vision. So the core insight here is to shift from building based on assumptions to building based on, real world evidence. And every experiment should aim to validate a specific hypothesis about your business.
So it's like learning with proof, not just assuming you're right with your initial ideas and just running with it.
Precisely. Yeah. And that brings us to the fourth principle, which is build, measure, learn.
Okay.
And this is the fundamental feedback loop that really drives progress in a lean startup, right?
Okay.
So you take an idea, you quickly build a version of it, often, a very basic one. You meticulously measure how customers respond to it, and then you learn from that data. What worked, what didn't work, what needs to be, adjusted. Think of this as like your engine for progress.
Yeah.
The faster you can complete this loop, the faster you learn what resonates, what doesn't, and the entire methodology is really geared toward accelerating the cycle as much as possible, right?
Yeah.
To minimize wasted time and resources.
Makes perfect sense. It's this continuous process of refining your understanding and your offering based on these real-world interactions. And then what's the fifth principle that kind of completes this foundation?
Yeah, so the fifth principle is pivot or persevere.
Okay.
So after each iteration of that build, measure, learn cycle, you face this crucial decision, right? Based on the data and the insights that you've gained, do you stick with your current strategy and persevere, or do you fundamentally change course, which is what a pivot is?
Okay.
And the crucial takeaway here is that failure isn't final. It's information that guides your next move, right? Whether it's deeper into your current path or onto a new one altogether. And this isn't about impulsively changing direction at the first sign of trouble, but it's about making these informed strategic adjustments that are grounded in validated learning.
Now, the book makes a really interesting point about how we should think about progress in a lean startup. And it's not just about the number of features you ship, right?
Right.
It's centered around this concept of validated learning.
Yeah, it's a fundamental shift in perspective, I think. So in traditional manufacturing, progress is often measured by efficient production of high-quality physical goods. But in a lean startup, especially in those early stages, the most valuable output is validated learning. So this is the knowledge gained about your customers, your market, and your business model through those rapid build, measure, learn cycles.
And this learning can be kind of intangible, right? And the book even acknowledges this can be a source of frustration, especially for people who are accustomed to more tangible measures of output.
Absolutely, yeah. The book even talks about this common experience, right?
Yeah.
Of engineers equating a productive day with the amount of code they wrote.
Right.
Right. Code and product features, they're visible, they're concrete deliverables, whereas, learning can feel less substantial, right?
Exactly.
But the lean startup argues that the seemingly intangible learning is precisely what prevents you from investing a ton of effort into building products that nobody wants. Right?
All right.
So ultimately, leading to far less waste in the long run, it's about prioritizing those learning activities, even if they don't immediately result in a shippable feature or product.
And this emphasis on learning leads to like a significantly different approach to business planning, doesn't it? The book famously kind of contrasts the traditional detailed business plan with a more adaptable, learning-focused strategy.
Yeah, the analogy that it uses is pretty powerful. So the traditional business plan is likened to planning a rocket launch, right? Incredibly detailed, with every single step meticulously planned in advance. And the inherent risk, of course, is that just like a rocket launch, even small errors in your initial assumptions can lead to catastrophic failure, much later on. So it's a very rigid and inflexible approach.
Whereas the lean startup methodology is more akin to navigating in a car.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you have a destination in mind, that's your overarching vision, but you're constantly adjusting your route based on real-time information.
Right.
Road conditions, traffic, unexpected detours, the feedback that you're getting as you drive.
Yeah.
So it's a far more adaptable and responsive approach. And in fact, the book shares a cautionary tale of a company that flawlessly executed a meticulously crafted business plan that projected, significant customer adoption. They hit all their internal milestones, had a successful launch in terms of execution, and yet they ultimately achieved failure because their fundamental assumption about customer demand was completely wrong. Right? They had invested heavily in infrastructure, in a fully featured product based on a non-existent influx of users, and they lacked the agility to pivot when those users didn't materialize.
It really underscores that danger of clinging to a plan when the foundational assumptions haven't been tested and validated in the real world. So instead of these static, rigid plans, the lean startup champions constant evolution, right? This dynamic interplay of optimization and strategic pivots.
Precisely. So a startup's journey involves these ongoing product changes through optimization, what the book refers to as tuning the engine. So these are the incremental tweaks and improvements that you make based on direct customer feedback and the data that you're collecting. And then less frequently, you might need to make a more fundamental strategic shift, a pivot, but the overarching vision, right? The ultimate problem that you're trying to solve usually remains consistent.
Okay.
And setbacks aren't viewed as like absolute failures, but as these invaluable learning opportunities that guide you toward, your ultimate destination.
And it's not a linear process of doing one thing at a time, right?
Right.
The book kind of paints this picture of a startup as managing a whole portfolio of interconnected activities simultaneously.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're constantly, operate the core product or service. You're actively acquiring and serving your existing customers. You're continuously making those incremental improvements. You're also constantly evaluating whether a more significant strategic change is needed. You're steering the ship, as the book puts it. And the challenge of entrepreneurship really lies in effectively balancing all these crucial activities, whether you're a tiny fledgling startup or a large established corporation that still needs to innovate to remain competitive and relevant. And the specific mix and emphasis on these activities might evolve as a company grows, but the fundamental need to manage them in concert remains constant.
Yeah, the book then shares this really relatable anecdote about an entrepreneur named Mark, who seemingly had like all the ingredients for success. A talented team, a compelling vision, yet still felt like something essential was missing. He described it as having all the necessary raw materials, but lacking the spark, the fire to really ignite.
Yeah, and I think this perfectly illustrates this critical gap that often exists. So Mark had diligently studied traditional management theories, which often focus on establishing the right organizational structures, right? Assembling the right teams for innovation. However, these theories often treat the actual process of innovation itself as a sort of black box, right? Something that hopefully happens, but without offering much practical, actionable guidance on how to effectively navigate its inherent uncertainties. And Rote found himself within that black box, keenly aware of the need for concrete tools and methodologies to move forward.
And that's precisely where the lean startup methodology kind of steps in, right?
Exactly.
It's presented as providing that much-needed practical guidance, defined set of principles and practices designed to help entrepreneurs across all kinds of ventures to really increase their odds of building something successful.
Exactly. It's about, providing a structured framework and a disciplined approach for effectively navigating that inherent uncertainty and ultimately transforming those raw materials into a sustainable and thriving fire.
To really illustrate that these aren't just abstract concepts, the book introduces this example of Intuit, this fairly large and well-established company How does a company like that fit into this lean startup picture?
So Intuit and its visionary founder, Scott Cook, I think serve as a really powerful and compelling case study of a larger, more established company successfully embracing what the book terms entrepreneurial management. So back in 1983, Cook had what was then a really radical idea that personal financial management could effectively done on a personal computer, right?
Right.
And their path to success was far from, guaranteed, right? They face established competitors and an initially small market, yet they not only, survived, but they thrived, right? Evolving into a Fortune 1000 company with this diverse portfolio of highly successful products.
And how did they manage to kind of maintain that kind of sustained innovation over time?
So the key was their gradual but significant evolution towards this entrepreneurial management philosophy.
Hmm.
And they recognize that in today's rapidly changing landscape, innovation can't be solely a top-down process.
Right.
So relying exclusively on, traditional centralized planning and analysis in these highly uncertain environments inevitably becomes a bottleneck, right?
Right.
And Scott Cook himself is quoted as observing that the real constraint isn't the lack of innovative ideas within teams or the eagerness of entrepreneurs to get their products to customers for real-world validation. Instead, the impediment often lies with leaders who remain entrenched in a mindset of pure, protracted analysis and planning, hindering rapid experimentation.
So it's like a fundamental shift in the role and mindset of leadership within an organization.
Precisely. And so Cook emphasized that the primary responsibility of senior management, it shifts from being the ultimate decision makers on every new idea to instead creating robust experimentation systems and fostering a pervasive culture where empowered teams are encouraged and enabled to move quickly, right?
Yeah.
Iterating and innovating based on real-world data gleaned from those experiments. And he uses this really vivid analogy describing the desired shift from leaders acting like Caesar with their thumbs up and down on every initiative, right, to building a sophisticated system that facilitates rapid learning and adaptation. And this fundamental change in leadership's role led to this really dramatic acceleration in Intuit's ability to bring successful new products to market. So whereas historically it took them an average of 5.5 years for a successful new product to generate $50 million in revenue, right?
Right.
They began to see entirely new offerings reaching that significant milestone in under a year.
Wow. Cutting down from 5.5 years to under a year. That's incredible. What a testament to this approach.
Absolutely.
Now, the book kind of circles back to the author's own pivotal experiences at IMVU to really underscore the critical importance of one of these core lean startup principles, which is the absolute necessity of directly engaging with potential customers and the immense power of validated learning derived from those interactions.
Yeah, this particular part of the book, I think, offers some really revealing insights. So despite this dedicated IMVU team, diligently working on their product, continuously making what they believed were improvements, attracting a steady stream of new users, they consistently struggled to convert those users into time customers. They were operating under a set of fundamental assumptions about what their target audience truly desired, assumptions that were, largely based on their own internal thinking and projections.
And what ultimately proved to be like the crucial turning point for them.
Necessity, in a sense, right? So out of a degree of, I think, desperation, they made the decision to actually go out and talk directly to potential customers. They invited people into their office, and they carefully observed how they interacted with their product in this real-world setting. And what they discovered through these direct observations was that their initial mental model of how people used software, and more specifically what they were looking for in a virtual social experience, was significantly flawed. So, for instance, they had operated under this assumption that users primarily wanted like an IM add-on that would seamlessly integrate with their existing buddy lists across, various platforms.
That wasn't what customers actually wanted at all, though, was it?
Not in the slightest, yeah. So the overwhelming feedback that they got was that customers didn't want just a mere add-on, right? They desired a completely separate standalone IM network. They weren't resistant to learning a new program. In fact, many early adopters were already actively using multiple IM clients. And furthermore, their core assumption that users primarily wanted to engage with their existing real-world friends in this avatar-based environment also proved to be incorrect.
Right.
Instead, many users were actually excited about the prospect of forging entirely new connections and friendships within this virtual space. And so this direct customer feedback, while sometimes challenging to hear, right?
Yeah.
Completely dismantled their fundamental strategic assumptions.
Yeah, that must have been a difficult realization, recognizing that so much of their previous development work had been based on these incorrect assumptions. And the author even vividly describes this painful but necessary decision to discard thousands of lines of meticulously written code. I mean, every developer knows that feeling of having to scrap code that you poured your heart into. And it really underscores the importance of validating the direction first.
Yeah, it was indeed a painful but ultimately invaluable learning experience.
Right.
And it perfectly illustrates a core tenet of the lean startup, which is that productivity in a startup should not be measured by the sheer volume of output,
Right.
such as, lines of code written or features developed, but rather by the quantity and quality of validated learning that's acquired. So the subsequent strategic pivot, while it required them to discard a significant amount of prior work, ultimately set them on a far more productive trajectory because it was now directly aligned with actual demonstrated customer needs and desires. And the tangible improvements they then observed in their key metrics served as this quantitative validation that their learning was genuine and impactful.
This pivotal experience at IMVU also led to this development of this rather counterintuitive concept that the book aptly terms the audacity of zero. Could you explain what that refers to?
Yeah, so this is a concept that often surprises people. The book posits that sometimes having absolutely zero revenue, zero customers, and zero market traction can paradoxically make it easier to attract investment or secure resources than having a very small, almost negligible amount of traction. And the reasoning behind this is that zero invites pure imagination and leaves open the alluring possibility of this explosive, unconstrained, overnight success.
Right.
Whereas small, unimpressive numbers can often breed doubt and raise these difficult questions in the minds of investors about whether significant scalable growth will ever realistically materialize.
So it creates this kind of almost perverse incentive to potentially postpone actively seeking early customer feedback and real-world validation until you feel absolutely certain of achieving some kind of significant initial success.
Exactly, yeah. And as the book astutely points out, intentionally delaying that crucial process of collecting real-world data and customer feedback only serves to amplify the amount of wasted effort and significantly increase the inherent risk of ultimately building a product or service that nobody truly wants or needs.
Right.
And IMVU experienced this dynamic firsthand, right?
Yeah.
Their initial, somewhat tepid early revenue figures actually led some potential investors to lose confidence and even suggest that they revert to this stealth mode approach. And it wasn't until they executed their strategic pivot and began to demonstrate meaningful improvements in their key metrics through this rigorous continuous experimentation and learning that investor confidence was finally restored and their trajectory shifted decisively.
So the crucial takeaway here is that even seemingly insignificant early data, even if it's not overwhelmingly positive, it's incredibly valuable for the learning process and for effectively guiding your subsequent steps and strategic decisions. Now let's kind of pivot to a different but related concept, this principle of think big, start small. And the book uses this remarkable success story of Zappos as a prime illustration of this principle in action.
Right. So Zappos, which is now this giant in the online shoe and apparel retail space, didn't launch with massive state-of-the-art warehouses and this enormous preemptive inventory, right?
Right.
Its visionary founder, Nick Swinburne, he harbored this grand vision to create this superior online shoe shopping experience that rivaled or even surpassed the traditional brick-and-mortar experience. But instead of making massive upfront investments based purely on this vision, he wisely chose to begin with a very small-scale focused experiment designed to directly test his core hypothesis, which was Are customers genuinely willing and able to comfortably purchase shoes online without the ability to physically try them on first?
And what exactly did that initial minimal experiment kind of look like in practice?
So his initial approach was remarkably low-tech and resourceful. He would visit local shoe stores, he would ask the owners if he could take photographs of their current inventory, and then post those photographs online on a very rudimentary website he'd created. And if a customer placed an order for a particular pair of shoes through his fledgling online store, he would then physically go back to the local store, purchase the shoes at full retail price, and then ship them directly to the customer. So it was this incredibly manual, small-scale operation.
But it provided him with invaluable real-world data.
Right. Absolutely. So it yielded a clear, quantifiable outcome, right? It provided direct evidence of whether or not people were indeed willing to buy shoes online. And more importantly, it allowed him to directly interact with those early customers, understand their specific needs, address their concerns about buying shoes, sight unseen, and begin to build these crucial relationships with potential future partners who were those local shoe store owners. And this deliberately small-scale, resource-efficient experiment, it didn't in any way limit the ambitious long-term vision for Zappos, which ultimately, grew into this multi-billion-dollar business and was eventually acquired by Amazon. But it served as this critical early validation of that fundamental customer demand before significant capital was deployed.
This leads us very nicely into this concept of the minimum viable product, or MVP, and the book provides several really, diverse and illustrative examples of what an MVP can look like in practice.
Yeah, so the MVP is absolutely central to the efficient operation of that build, measure, learn feedback loop.
Right.
It's not necessarily about building the absolute smallest product imaginable, right? Stripped of all features, right? Instead, it's about creating the fastest, most resource-efficient way to cycle through that critical feedback loop, allowing you to rigorously test your most critical underlying assumptions about your product or service. And the early story of Groupon is I think, a perfect example of this principle in action. So they began with incredibly basic MVPs, like manually created PDFs sent out via email to a small list of subscribers, often featuring just a single local deal, like a pizza coupon promoted through a simple blog.
Yeah.
And this remarkably basic approach was sufficient to validate that core idea of local time-sensitive deals and ultimately fueled, their explosive growth.
Yeah.
So, for you, the learner, thinking about any new projects or ideas that you might have, this principle suggests that starting with the absolute core functionality, right?
Yeah.
Just test if there's even an appetite for it before investing heavily in, developing a full-blown product.
And then there's this well-known example of Dropbox, whose initial MVP wasn't even a fully functional software product, was it?
No, their initial MVP was a surprisingly simple short video demonstrating that core concept of seamless file synchronization across multiple devices.
Right.
And it effectively addressed a problem that many potential users didn't even consciously realize they had. And the video itself wasn't highly polished. It even contained some in-jokes targeted specifically at, the technically savvy early adopter community on platforms like Dig, for instance. However, it resonated powerfully, right? And it quickly went viral within those early online communities. It drove hundreds of thousands of people to their website and caused their beta waiting list to explode literally overnight. And so it brilliantly demonstrated the desirability and inherent value of their proposed solution, even without a fully built and functional product. And they strategically included these Easter eggs, right, to specifically resonate with and attract their ideal early adopters.
And the book also highlights these fascinating examples of Food on the Table and Aardvark with their Concierge and Wizard of Oz MVPs. Did you elaborate on how those worked?
Yeah, so Food on the Table, or FOT, they employed what's known as a concierge MVP, right? So instead of immediately building a complex software platform, the founders manually curated personalized weekly menus and accompanying shopping lists for a small group of early customers. They even conducted in-home visits to deeply understand their customers' specific needs, their dietary preferences, their pain points around meal planning, and only after rigorously validating the underlying demand for such a service and gaining a rich understanding of their customers' needs through this very hands-on manual approach, did they begin to invest in automating the process through software development. So Aardvark, on the other hand, they utilized what's called Wizard of Oz testing. So early users who posed questions to the service, they believed that they were interacting with a sophisticated AI-powered question answering engine.
Right.
However, behind the scenes, it was actually real human beings that were manually sifting through information and crafting responses. Yeah. So this clever approach allowed them to effectively test whether,